Okay. Welcome everybody to Shannara Collegium. Let me pull up the start screen. One. This is Woven Belts, How and Why by Lael Fitzmorgan de Mercedes. And I'm going to pass it on to her.
All right, folks. Hi, my name is Lael Fitzmorgan de Mercedes. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I will be talking about woven belts today. So, first thing I need from you all is to run a poll. I'm not going to do a Zoom poll, but I want either a show of hands, or you can, if we have the ability to, you can type in the chat. How many of you have made woven belts before, or have some experience with weaving or macrame even? Okay. All right then. Okay, so next question is, what are we looking to learn today? Do you want to be seeing a demo? Do you want to just have a discussion? I can do either one. Sure, we can do a basic overview with the demo at the end. Timing a demo at the end is going to be tough, but we can do that. All right, so let me go ahead and get the screen share started. This one. So I would hazard a guess that most people wear belts of some kind. I'm not sure. I think Bellegarth has a tendency to go with leather belts over woven ones. Woven ones are a very Amtgard thing. And that's most of where I reside at the moment. I started in Amtgard in 2015 and then bounced back and forth between Bellegarth and Amtgard for a while. Then went and played Dagorkir for a bit, and now I'm back in Amtgard. So with a leather belt, you typically have a ring and then the belts, and there might be some decorations, there might be some carving, there might be some sort of tail cap at the end. And really, a macrame belt is very similar. You have the ring, you have the weave. The weave is the mechanics by which the belt was made. You have the pattern, which is the color that is applied to that weave. You have that material, whatever you've made it out of. You have typically an end knot of some kind. And then usually Amtgarders like to have a little bit of a tail at the end. So that's the rest of the cords that are being finished off somehow. And then typically we finish those tails in some way. And usually things that we care about are making sure that everything looks clean. If stuff looks clean, it's good. Or it's good enough anyway. So to get started with making a belt, you'll need a few things. You need some sort of cord. You need a ring of some kind. You need scissors, a lighter, and some sort of way to hold tension. I like to use my toe. That's a technique that I learned when I was first starting weaving. And some people like to use like command hooks on the wall or a over the door coat rack sort of thing. A tension hook's not strictly necessary, but it's very, very helpful, and weaving without it is very difficult. Before I talk too much more about the methods and stuff, let me talk a little bit about what this kind of weaving is. This particular kind of weaving is called finger weaving. It is not done on a loom. It's not done with an inkle loom. It's not really braiding. It is weaving. And there are lots and lots of different ways to do it. And the history of finger weaving comes primarily from Native American traditions. There's also some history of finger weaving from the Scandinavian countries, from South American countries and from China and other Asian countries as well. So there's a lot of history, and most of what LARPers know, and particularly Amtgarders who do this kind of thing, not that doesn't exist in Belgarth, it's more common in Amtgard. But most of what LARPers know comes from or is related to this Native American tradition. And what I do know from my conversations with Native weavers is that the weaving itself is an open practice, but it's really important to make sure that we're careful with the symbolism that we use so that we're not appropriating any of their cultural aspects. Okay, all that said, let me dig into some more specifics on what you might pick when you're putting together a belt. For your rings, there are lots of different options. Actually, there's lots of different options for all these things. For rings, you might use something that's steel or brass or aluminum. I've picked up some nylon rings and fashion belt buckles. And the choice of ring really depends on what you want the belt to look like. If you're doing a basic belt, it's a good idea to just pick up some cheap aluminum rings or cheap steel rings. And really, you want nickel-plated steel. Nickel-plated steel won't rust over time, and regular steel has a chance to. Aluminum rings, I found, if you go to slingrings.com, aluminum rings are pretty cheap. They come in fun colors, and they're really lightweight, which is nice. And I'll have some links. I've got some links and resources at the end of this presentation, and I'll share this whole presentation with the Collegium so that you can go look at those resources at a later time. For the cord itself, you've got a number of options, and I have the pictures here. So typically, LARPers like to use macrame cord. Macrame cord, usually you get Bonnie braid, and actually I see I've got 4mm Bonnie braid pictured there. Most folks like the 6mm. 6mm comes in a lot of colors. The 4mm does as well. And the size of the cord mostly dictates what kind of patterns and how much of a pattern you can create. The smaller the cords, the more cords you'll have to weave, but the more cords you can put on a single ring, and therefore the more variability you have in the pattern itself. So that's that for macrame cord. Macrame cord is polypropylene, so it melts really nicely. It's really easy to fuse together, actually, and as long as you fuse things well, then that's going to be one of the strongest parts of your belt, actually. Paracord is slightly different. Paracord is nylon, and paracord has a colorful shell around a whole bunch of little white nylon core cords. And that also comes in all sorts of colors and all sorts of sizes. And you let your imagination run wild as long as you have the cash for it. Paracord is more expensive than macrame cord, but if you're looking to make a lot of something, buy it in the 1,000-foot spools, because that's your cheapest bet per yard. The last cord that I know of for this type of belt anyway is cotton cord. This is something I have been playing with recently. You can make Paracord Planet has both 4 and 5mm wide cotton rope, and that's great for weaving. It's cotton is a very comfortable cord to work with. It's a very comfortable material to wear, and it weaves beautifully. As far as weaving goes, this is kind of what LARPers use, which is very different from what most native weavers that I know or have seen use. They tend to use like yarn, which is much, much smaller and gives you a very different set of possibilities. but for those of us who are worried about our pocketbooks, macrame cord is going to be your best bet. You can also do things like make t-shirt yarn and weave that or braid that. T-shirt yarn stretches a whole lot more than the plastics do, and actually a lot more than even the cotton rope does. But if you're really worried about your pocketbook, that would be a good way to use something that's probably on hand or much cheaper than even the Bonnie braid cord. Okay, that's that for materials. So let me talk about the different types of weaving. There are a whole there's a whole bunch of different types of weaving, and actually there's one on here that's not been I know of a new to me type of weaving that's not pictured here. But typically, these are the kinds of weaves you'll see. There's vertical weaving, horizontal weaving, braiding of some kind, macrame knotting. There's an interlaced weaving method, and then you can also take paracord bracelet tying patterns and make those bigger, scale them up for belts. Vertical and horizontal weaves are the most common. In fact, the horizontal weave is what I'll show you today. This is the weave that's pictured there in number 2 is what we call the S weave or the diagonal weave. Or sometimes it's called the candy cane weave. And that's because it makes diagonal stripes. That's called a horizontal weave because the pattern moves horizontally as you weave down the belt. Whereas with a vertical weave, the pattern remains the same. I mentioned braiding. There's a lot of different types of braiding. What's pictured here are on the left. That's a 6-strand braid, except that I used sets of 3 strands as a single strand. So you've got 6 sets of 3 that are being woven back and forth. And on the right is something called an interlaced braid, or it's also called the God's Eye braid. Macrame knotting is not something I know a whole lot about. There's lots of videos out on YouTube there, but it creates a whole lot of patterns that you can't get in weaving, and that's kind of cool. Interlaced weaving is a technique that I learned and have started sharing with the LARPing community. This one comes directly from native traditions. Again, patterns are, for the most part, an open practice, but symbolism is important. So essentially, an interlaced weaving pattern is where you do a diagonal or horizontal weave, and then in the middle, you switch the position of the cords so that you can control where the colors stay in the pattern. And with paracord patterns, basically, if you look up something on YouTube and you look up a paracord pattern, you can scale it up to be for belts. You can sort of set up a ratio. You take their cut length over the final length of the piece and compare that to whatever cut length you'll need, which is what you're solving for, and compare to the final length of the piece that you want. So with paracord stuff, it's really a go find it, learn it, and make it bigger. I mentioned end knots. A lot of folks who are just starting to weave will get to the end of their belt and say, oh, I'm done, and they'll do a big overhand knot just to tie it off. That works fine, but there's been a large cultural shift toward having really pretty end knots. So, and those end knots, the end knots that are most common are based on one of 2 things. Either this thing that's called a Solomon bar, or these things called single half hitches. A Solomon bar is shown in this bottom left-hand picture. That sort of shows that diagram there shows you half of a Solomon knot. So a single tie there is what's called a Solomon bar. And the top 3 photos on the right show you what you can do with Solomon bars. And the single half hitches is basically you're tying an overhand knot sort of with a single strand around a series of cords. And you can get a variety of things that way. You can do this thing that we call a lobster tail, this blue and yellow piece. I like to take that same pattern and I will weave colors through it, which is that bottom middle picture there. And then you can also make a single-sided spiral in the same manner. With that, you would just take a single strand and do a series of half pitches all the way around the end. So, and lastly, if you're at the end of your belt and you've tied it off, then you've got a whole bunch of cords that are sort of hanging out. You should have a bunch of extra at the end. And there's lots of different things you can do about it, do with those. And the main thing, again, is just that folks like it to be clean. Folks like it to look pretty. And you could just trim and melt the ends. You could knot the ends and melt them off. I've done some braiding. You can add beads. You can tie fancier knots. Or you can fluff it. I will say, if you decide that you want to have a fluffy tail belt, you should make sure that you have a wide tooth comb on you regularly. You should make sure you take some time to brush it. And more importantly, you need to make sure that you tie good knots before you fluff it so that the knots don't come undone. Okay, so that's a sort of an overview of the typical possibilities for belts. And so what I want to do now, before we go into demo time here, is talk a little bit about what belts mean and what they are. In Amtgard, we use belts to communicate a lot of things. Knights wear a white belt. Squires wear a red belt. Men, women, and people at arms wear either black belts with silver trim or green belts, and pages will wear yellow belts. And I've laid that out in the hierarchy of who can give belts to who. So knights can take squires, knights and squires can take people at arms, and all three can take pages. So that's sort of how belted families and knighting works in Amtgard. And in Belegarth, where we have a white belt, Belegarth tends to go with the heater shield. Both games use a chain. Where Amtgard has a red belt, Belegarth has the Squire white tabard, which is almost always reversible with yellow because of the expectations for service and volunteerism. And as far as I know, Belegarth has retainers rather than people at arms or pages. And I don't know if there's any symbolism involved, but so I'm not sure that there's a real good parallel there. I'll also say that Amtgard and Belegarth both have a tendency to use belts to show off or to show unit or fighting company unity. So Belegarth calls units, and Amtgard calls the same sort of group a fighting company. Oh, there's chat stuff that I'm not seeing. Thank you. Yes. Pages and retainers don't wear symbolic items. And belt flags sometimes will be worn by a page. Thank you for that info. So that's a quick look into what different things mean in Amtgard. So if you see somebody who's a cross gamer and they're wearing a red belt, they're a squire to someone, probably. And similarly, if they have a black belt with silver trim or a green belt or a yellow belt, they're probably in some sort of belted line. I will say, if like I said at the beginning, I think typically woven belts are not as common in Belegarth. So if there are belts that are done in in that macrame cord or they're done in paracord, you're more likely, it's more likely that that person at least plays Amtgard or cross games. This kind of woven belt is really practically non-existent in Dagorhir. It's not really something that's common in other LARPs that I've seen. Okay.
Yeah, just the.
So that's a good. I think that's a good introduction to how belts work in this game and what those things are in Bellagar. Okay. Sorry, the background noise is my partner here, she's doing okay. Oh, thank you. That's interesting. Apparently, the leather woven belt difference might depend on location, as there are several people who wear woven belts. Where is that? So I'm on the East Coast, and I came from the Midwest. So the Midwest and the East Coast, Bellagar is practically non-existent on the East Coast, but apparently in Idaho, leather and woven belts are both fairly common. All right then. Okay, I'm gonna stop screen sharing. Actually, before I do that, let me show you just what that resources page looks like. This is the last slide, and that's what you'll be looking for when I pop this into the chat at the end of the day. Okay, so now we get to play with figuring out how to do this background stuff. All right. So I'm gonna turn my computer around, and I'm gonna show you how to do a basic S-weave belt. That's that horizontal candy cane belt that I was showing you. And at this point, I'm not going to be able to see the chat. So if you have a question, I need you to use your microphone if you can, or maybe what we can do is have somebody put the question in the chat, and my room monitor, would you be able to read those questions out for me?
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
This will be an experiment. Let's see. All right. So the question is, can you all see a hand and a foot?
Yes.
Okay. This will work. Great. So I have with me here and at any time, if you can't see what I'm doing, let me know.
Will do.
All right. So I have here with me this is a purple aluminum ring from slingrings.com. I've got a bunch of paracord here. This happens to be some scrap that I got from a friend. The colors are the same as another demonstration I did a while ago. And so let's set this up. So at the beginning of any belt, the first thing you want to do is put the string on the ring. And the way to do that is to take your cord, fold it in half, and you'll have a loop at the end. And you pass that loop through the ring, and then take those two ends through the loop you made, pull through, and pull that tight. This knot is called a lark's head knot. And so let me do that again with the rest of these. And while I'm doing this, let me talk a little bit about measuring for belts. So in general, when you measure cords for a belt, you'll notice that I am I am folding these cords in half. So when you cut cords for a belt, you need to keep that in mind. So if that plays into the way I describe how we cut these. So typically, when you measure cords for a belt, you figure out how long you want the belt to be, and then you multiply that number by 3. And that final number that you get is the length of the cord that you're going to cut, which is then, of course, double. That is then double the final length of the cord that will be hanging off your ring. So the way I like to think about that is cord versus strands. So before I've put the cord on the ring, it is just a cord. And once I've put it on the ring, it is now a strand. So if I want to make about a 6 foot long belt, I will cut each cord about 8 yards long. So we've got 6 feet times 3 would be 6 yards. However, you're still going to need some space for the end knot and your tail. So I like to add another yard or 2 to each of my cords so that I have enough material left to make the end knot. So that's where I get the 8 yard number. And 8 yards might actually be a bit much, but once you put those cords on your ring, now you have a bunch of what would be 4 yard strands. That makes sense to everybody?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So now I have a whole bunch of cords here that I've tied on, and now I have a bunch of strands and tied on with lark's head knots. And you'll notice I've been tightening these as I'm speaking. And that's something you want to do with your ring, mostly so that your strands don't slide all over the place on the ring that you're working with. And width-wise, there's a couple of interesting things that happen with macrame cord. And this happens to be paracord, but the same thing happens. Your final belt width will always be less than the width of whatever you've put on your ring. And usually I find that it ends up being about 80% of that width. So whatever you put on your ring, you'll get the final width will be about 80% of that width at the end of the day. So, which means that a good rule to follow is to never fill your ring more than halfway with cord. If your ring is flat and wide for some reason, you need to take out more cord, so put less cord on the ring. So I'm going to add a couple of strands here, a couple of cords here for just some color variation. That way we can see the line pattern and see how that shows up. So I'm not sure how many arts and sciences competitions Belagarth has across the country. They weren't particularly, arts and sciences competitions were not particularly popular in the Midwest. But if you're doing arts and sciences competitions, it's a really good idea to make sure that your lark's head knots are all tied in the same direction. It is just fine if you tie them the other way. See if I can tie them this way. So if I put my loop underneath the ring instead, like this is still a lark's head knot. It's just in the other direction. But if you're going to be entering competitions of any kind in Amtgard or Belagarth or similar, it's a good idea to have good consistency and to keep all of those lark's head knots in the same direction. All right, so I'm going to use my toe as an attention keeper here. If you have a really small ring, this won't work real well because your toe's too big. But otherwise it should be all. Some folks can have some pain if you pull too much on your toe. So wall hooks are always a good idea. You can also hook things to tables and such. You could put a clamp down or something, and that would work just fine. The biggest thing with weaving, actually, before I start, let me talk about this a little bit. With weaving, there's a Amtgard has this culture of wanting to pull everything as tight as it possibly can be for a weave, and personally, I don't like that because pulling things as tight as possible really hurts my hands, and I don't think it's good for the body long term. And the Native American style of weaving is kind of the opposite. It's not necessarily as loose as possible, but because they use different types of cord and their weaving style is slightly different, it's more about consistency than it is about being tight. And so that's what I like to teach as well, is that weaving, to me at least, is not about having the tightest possible weave. It's about being tight enough that it looks good and consistent throughout. And to me, that's what's important. So what I'm going to do first here is I'm going to split all of my cords. I'm going to pick up every other cord. So I like to start from the outside on the left side, and I'll pick up every other cord. So I've split this is called the warp. These are going to be warp threads, and this horizontal type of weaving has what we call a changing weft. A weft cord is the cord that goes left to right, or weft to white, if you want to remember it that way. And so this is actually kind of a shortcut for weaving. So I'll show you this, and then I'll show you a little simpler way, a more direct way of doing it. And what I like to do is I take this first outside cord, and now that I've split the warps, I just pass it through, and that's my first row. If that's a little confusing, that's okay. Basically, what I've done is shortcutted the over-under process. So if I take for the next row, I can do the same thing, but I'll take this cord and I'll go over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way across. And I say that this is a changing weft weave because that's exactly what's happened here. In my first row, I had this first cord, this first strand as my weft, my working strand, and in the next row, I had a different strand that was my working strand. So this cord is going to get folded under and become part of the warp now. And at this point, I will tug these first cords tight. And we'll tug this a little bit tighter. We'll tug that a little bit tighter. There. And then we repeat. So I'll pick up the leftmost strand, bring it up, and I'm going to go over, under, all the way across the row. Are there any questions at this point? I feel like I've been bringing up lots of different small concepts about weaving as I go. And here's my first weft strand that's now part of the warp. So we're going to go under that one and over the last one. You can absolutely weave under, over first. That's fine. It's not how I do it, but that's all right. As long as you are consistent with what you're doing, it'll look fine.
No questions currently in chat.
Okay, thank you very much. Alrighty. So I talked about how consistency is more important than something being tight, really, really tight. So I suppose the question then becomes, what is tight enough? And to me, tight enough is, at least with this kind of weaving, is such that you can't see light through it if you bend. If you bend your weave and you can't see light through it, you're good. I could pull this really, really, really tight and make it really small, but I don't need to. And what's kind of nice is that if you don't pull it super tight, you don't need as much cord to get the same width. All right. So I'm going to weave a few more rows, and I'm going to show you a couple more tricks that I like to do while I'm weaving here. One of the things I like to do is I use my fingers to separate the warp, and then that allows me to pull on these sets of strands, this upper strand and these lower strands individually, which allows me to modulate and control the tension in this vertical direction as well as the tension in the horizontal direction. And for the tension in the horizontal direction, a lot of folks tend to just pull as tight as they can. And for me, what I do is I pull in this direction, and I'll also push the previous strand in with my forefinger or my thumb while I'm doing that, because that helps keep the row even while you're going down. So here once again, so what I've done here is I'm not holding things between my fingers as much because this is a really tiny piece. Aha! I made a good mistake there. I missed one of my strands. So because paracord likes to hold its shape, it's easier to just pick up my bottom strand and put down my top strands. And as long as you do that in order all the way across, you're doing the exact same thing as if you were going over, under individually. And this just makes weaving a lot faster. And so now I'm tugging on all of these bottom strands here so that you can, again, control that tension in the vertical direction. Okay.
About how long does it usually take you to complete a basic belt?
Okay, so a basic belt like this, if I were to continue this pattern in belt shape, belt length, something like this will take 4 or 5 hours. I know some folks who can weave a full length belt in like 2 hours. But for me, it's more like 4 to 5. And that's fairly common, I think, for a lot of people. There are other patterns that take significantly longer, mostly because they are more complex. But something like this you can do in half a day. I finished a whole belt on a car ride before. I was not driving. It is very difficult to drive and weave, I imagine. It's not something I've ever tried.
Do you do belts on commission?
I do.
How do you go about pricing them?
Okay. Give me just a moment here. My leg is falling asleep. I want to toss something in here. So for belts on commission, as a quick answer, I'm not currently taking commissions, but with pricing, I tend to price material by the yard and charge for the material cost plus somewhere between like $8 and $10 an hour, depending on what it is that I'm doing. Let me turn this around. My foot's getting tired.
And then is there a way to take a break from a weave, or is it once you begin, you need to keep going until it's all the way completed?
Yeah. So let me grab a couple of my favorite things. My favorite tools. My girlfriend bought these chip clips.
And you've stolen most of them.
Yes, I have absconded with most of them. She's very mad at me for it. They're absolutely one of my favorite things for weaving belts. Let's see. How do I set this up so you can still see this? Are we back in visible range?
Yes.
All right. So what I like to do is take a chip clip. I really like this wire style, actually. I bought some large plastic chip clips that were really long, and I just don't use them. I like these better. But I imagine everybody could find their own preference. But chip clips will very easily hold your weave in place. There is a slight downside to chip clips like this, though. Macrame and paracord both have a tendency to deform a little bit because they're plastics. So if you leave a weave for a couple weeks like this, where you've put a chip clip there, you'll probably have a slight dent in the weave. And when you take it out, when you take the chip clip off, that dent will come out eventually, but it'll take some time to sort of heal itself. Another thing you can do is if you've got an extra piece of paracord, if you've got an extra piece of cord, or even with your most recent weft cord, you can just tie a quick knot. So I'm going to make a little loop here, pull my cord around the back, and pull it through. This is actually a single half hitch. And you can just pull it through like that, and that'll keep your weave more or less intact as well. When you come back, you will want to undo this knot and retighten that last row or so before you move on. But while I'm sitting here, I figure we've got the time. I might as well show you vertical weaves as well. I've got 15 minutes. So I'm going to swap the type of weaving that I'm doing right in the middle here. Do I want to do it with black? I don't know. We'll figure it out. Sure. So, one of the very common vertical weaves is what's called a single serpent. And all of these weaves have tutorials that I've linked in the weaving tutorial playlist. So basically, in a single serpent weave, you want to have one very, very long cord. So where most of your warp strands were, your warp cords were initially cut at 8 yards long, this now working strand, this weft strand, you want to cut that at more like 12, 13, 14 sort of yards long. My cat is playing with the cord.
You were kind of like
I know.
flapping it about in a very playful manner, and now she's like, oh, this is toy time.
You're a little off screen there. There you go.
So the mechanics here are mostly the same. Let go of my cord. I cannot. So let me weave a couple rows here quick to get this set up so I can show you more what this one looks like. Because the switch is going to look goofy on this little sample. No. cat picked the worst possible time to get playful. All right. So when you've got a very, very long strand like this, the mechanics are basically the same, where you're going to go over, under, but you're actually swapping directions when you do so. So the first row, you're going to in the wrong direction. Give me 1 second. I like to weave from left to right. So let me get that set up. So we'll be doing exactly that. Alrighty. There we go. Okay. So for weaving from left to right, I'm going to take my working cord and I'm going to go over, under, all the way across the row. And again, you can weave under, over if you like. It really doesn't matter. The only thing that it changes is a little bit on how the weave looks at the end of the day. Right here, I like to put my finger between, again, so I can pull each cord in the vertical direction.
You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. We'll give this a tug on the other side. And the thing about this this single serpent weave is that you have to weave in both directions. So it's left to right, and now I have to turn around and go right to left. So I can weave over, under from this side if I like. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it, which I prefer, is to use your fingers to separate the warps like this. And then when you weave from the right side, it actually feels the same as weaving from the left side. So I'm going to take my upper warp here, bring that cord down, up, down, up, down to up, all the way across. And then I just pull my cord through. So here's my working cord, and that's going to pull through. You'll notice with a single serpent like this, my warp cord, my weft cord, the working strand that's going left to right, does show up on the edges. And so that's something to keep in mind from a design standpoint. If you want that cord to show up, use a contrast color. If you don't want it to be obvious, you'll want to use the same color as all of your warp strands. So now I'm at a row where my working cord is on the right side, but I'm going to swap my warps from left to right, just like past. And then all I'm going to do is pass my working strand from right. Fingers between the warps. So now you've seen a horizontal weave. You can see the pattern that is moving diagonally, and you have seen also a little bit of a vertical weave where that pattern stays consistent throughout. Probably haven't used up much of my last 10 minutes. But honestly, my arms are getting real tired of being on the other side of the computer. So, let me turn us around. Are there any other questions or thoughts or wild ideas that you want to see if they're feasible?
Could you show us that finishing knot?
Sure, absolutely. Okay. I will turn this around again. It's gonna be the best way to do this. All right, so let me show you. I should be able to show you both finishing knots here. I got time.
You have 5 minutes.
That's more than enough to show you both finishing knots. All right. So the first finishing knot is, I'll show you the single hitch first. So essentially, a single hitch is an overhand knot. So I'm going to pass my my working cord. I went from right to left last. Actually, let me go. I prefer doing this from the other direction. So we can go ahead and do that. It's a little easier to show you when I know I can do it 100% correctly the first time. All right. All right. So once you've gotten to the end of your piece, one way to do a single hitch is to take your working strand, toss it over your piece. Again, you're basically tying an overhand knot. So I'm going to go all the way around. I'm going to take the end of this and I'm going to go underneath the loop that I've made and pull nice and tight. And when you pull these things nice and tight, you want to make sure that your the pulling motion that you do brings these things in consistently, so you have a nice even cinch on either side. For that single hitch, again, I have tossed my strand over the piece, and I'm going to pull underneath, and I'm going to start to get a nice spiral all the way around. Let me do. More of those. You can also, if you like, you can go over and you can tie the knot by going over the loop. So I've been going under the loop here. You can go over the loop. All that's going to do is change the directionality of your knot. I wouldn't suggest doing one and then the other. Again, as long as you're consistent, it'll look fine. And that's the important part. Okay. Solomon knots. You want to take 2 cords one from either end. I've just grabbed a couple because I've got the space for it. And essentially what you're going to do is make knots out of 4s. So you can take, for a Solomon bar, you take 1 cord, you make a 4 shape. You make sort of an L shape with the first cord. Take your other cord, layer it over. You're going to tuck that underneath the entire piece and pull through. And pull that nice and tight. And you'll want that to be up at the top of your piece. If you want to make Solomon bars, you now swap direction. So I went, my left side made the L, now my right side is going to make the L. I'm going to pull over, under and around, and through. And that is a Solomon bar. If I want to make a helix knot where these knots constantly spiral around, I would go in the same direction multiple times. So I just went from my right side with the L shape. So I'll make my backwards 4, flip that over, and pull here, and pull those tight. And if you were to continue that same direction, you'll see I'm starting already. I don't have enough length to do a very long version of this, but I'm already starting to get a very small little helix.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we got 1 minute. Less than
All right. that's all we got. We've gone through horizontal weaves, vertical weaves, a couple of end knots. Talk to you a whole bunch of history and such. And what I will do is I will post this PowerPoint on the after class chat room, and you'll be able to click on any of the links that are in the presentation and go do research of your own.
Thank you, Lael, for your wonderful class. This was Woven Belts, the How and the Why. All links to the presentation will be in the after class chat. Thank you. We are now going to go in for a lunch break for an hour, and we will be back at 2 o'clock with Feints and Baits with Vanson and in this room. Thank you, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock.